Before we start this video, a large thank you to Kadir, Pedro, Gustavo, and Thin for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And as always, an immense thank you to Halo Burner for their continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is, as always, sincerely appreciated, my friend, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, today we're going to add the primary and secondary projectile slots here to our UI, as well as to our quick slots. So right now we actually can't equip our projectiles via the equipment manager, so let's change that. Go to the player UI manager, go to the equipment manager, and let's unhide the menu so we can see what we're doing. I'm then going to duplicate this armor slots organizer here, and I'm going to rename it to projectile slots. And I'm going to delete the last two entries, the legs and hands. And I'm going to rename the first two entries from head and body to main projectile slot and secondary projectile slot. So these are going to be the buttons in which we equip our projectiles. Now, right now, if we go back into the player UI equipment manager, we don't actually have an enum value for a primary or secondary projectile slot. So let's go open up the enum script. You can see we have current selected equipment slot. We don't have an equipment slot to represent our projectiles. So let's open up our enums. Let's make one. Go down to your equipment type, and then let's add one for the main projectile and secondary projectile. And you can see here I have numbers next to these, so we can quickly see which one is which number at first glance. And this is because we fetch these values using a number. So I'll show you now in case you don't remember in a second. But these new two are going to be 10 and 11. So if we go back now into the player UI, you can see on this button here, if I scroll down, it actually sets the current equipment slot. And we're going to set this one to 10 for main projectile slot, and the secondary projectile slot to 11. So basically when we hover over these buttons, or scroll over them rather, it's going to tell the equipment manager which button we're currently selecting. Now let's copy load weapon inventory. Let's paste it right below. And let's change this from loading weapons to loading our projectiles. So I'm going to rename it to load projectile inventory. Now wherever you see weapon item, we're just going to rename this to projectile item. And by the way, if you get where I'm going with this so far and you want to pause the video now and attempt to finish this on your own, I highly encourage you to do so. It will be a great learning experience, and I think you can do it. You have all the information available to you. Or just look to the other ways that we load equipment if you feel lost. And yeah, pause the video now and try that if you want. Again, will be a great learning experience. Bonus points if you can set up how to get the ammo count on the equipment slots and actually update it. So pause the video and do that now if you want. And if not, continue with me. So change all of these weapon variables here to range projectile items. And then we're going to rename them to projectile. Now, most of this is pretty much the same. Like everything down here is pretty much identical, so we can leave that. Now let's look what we call load hand equipment inventory. We call it here where we're loading our total equipment inventory. So copy this and make another case here, but instead of hands, it's going to be main projectile. And now you can copy that again, and we're going to put in load projectile inventory. And since this is also true for the secondary projectile, we can just copy this again in its entirety. Change main projectile to secondary projectile, and now you are good to go. All right, looks good. So let's save that again. Now let's go back into the project, and you can see we have our inventory slot. Now, when we equip an item, we do it from here. So let's scroll down and see what happens. So everything is going to stay the same except for equip item. We need to add a case here for our projectiles. So we have one for our weapons, hands, our leg equipment, whatever. Copy one of these and paste it right at the bottom. Change the case to case equipment type main projectile. So if it's the main projectile, what are we doing? Well, we want to get it from our main projectile equipment slot. And then we want to say add to inventory. That's still the same. And then we're going to change the hand equipment to main projectile equals current item as main projectile, or sorry, range projectile item. And then everything else is pretty much the same, but all we're doing here now is just changing the equipment that you've copied to the new equipment type, which is our projectile equipment. And if it references a specific equipment slot, it's going to be the main projectile slot. So go around the player equipment manager, you can see here we don't actually have a function for load projectile equipment. So I was changing load hand equipment. So what I'm going to do is copy that and then paste it. I'll make a comment here actually for projectiles. So it's a little bit neater and it's just separated from everything else. And I'm going to go ahead and paste the load hand equipment. I'm going to change it to load main projectile equipment. I'm going to make the variable hand equipment range projectile item. And I'm just going to get rid of this unload hand models because there are no models that need to be loaded for our ranged equipment. And I'm going to change the hand thing to main projectile value ID. So it changes our main projectile when we change our network ID. And I'll change the hands to main projectile in the inventory. And again here, main projectile in the inventory. We don't need to disable our arms. There's no thing going on in the models here. There's no models to enable or disable, so we can delete that. And we don't need to calculate any armor absorption unless you're giving your quivers some kind of armor. And that looks good. All right, cool. So change this to main projectile ID. Now I will change the comments real fast. There we go. And now we can copy this in its entirety and paste it. And instead of saying load main projectile equipment, we can say load secondary projectile equipment. And as you probably guessed by now, we're just going to change the keyword main to secondary, and that's it. Now, if I had more than a handful of these slots, you could do it a little bit differently. But since we only have the 2, this is pretty straightforward. Okay, main to secondary, save, looks good. Let's go back to the player UI, the UI equipment inventory slot. Now we call load main projectile equipment, and we're passing our main projectile item from our inventory, like so. Excellent, looks good. We're still refreshing our UI after, that's good. Now we copy this in its entirety again, and we replace case main projectile with case secondary projectile. And then instead of searching our main projectile, we search our secondary projectile. So same thing, replace the main keyword here with secondary, and then we're good to go. Load main projectile equipment becomes load secondary projectile equipment. Main projectile becomes secondary projectile, and that's good. All right, let's save that again. And next, we're going to jump back to the project briefly, turn off this menu, save the player UI prefab. I'm going to yoink this item icon from Nephilim so I can see when I'm equipping it. That's going to drag that into my standard arrow here. Go back over to the refresh menu in the player UI equipment manager. And let's go to refresh equipment slots and see what's going on here. So we need to add a case here now for our projectile equipment, so we actually show the icons. So I'm going to copy the hand equipment because it was the last entry that I made here. Going to change the comment name to, you guessed it, main projectile equipment, or just projectile equipment, because I can put both under this comment. Hand equipment item becomes ranged projectile item. And then the hand equipment variable name becomes main projectile equipment. And the piece of gear I reference is, of course, the main projectile from the player.player inventory manager. Now, if the main projectile equipment is not null, now we don't have a main projectile equipment slot yet, but we're going to make that variable soon. So for now, it's going to throw you an error because it doesn't exist, but we're going to set main projectile equipment slot dot enabled to true, and the sprite is going to be that of the main projectile item icon. Otherwise, we disable the main projectile item slot icon. Do the same thing now, copy all this and change main to secondary. So we have it done for our secondary projectile slot as well. Player.player inventory manager dot secondary projectile, and I see now I made a mistake. I forgot to change the item icon to main projectile right here, so I'll do that real fast. It was still hand equipment icon. Main projectile equipment icon. It's really easy to miss stuff like that. This one is secondary projectile equipment item icon. And lastly, otherwise, the secondary projectile equipment icon is enabled .false. All right, cool. Let's go up here now and make those variables. So we can copy the button and the image because we're going to need both. So I'm going to paste this. I just copy the hand, and I'll change hand to main projectile equipment slot and main projectile equipment slot button. And then we're going to do the same thing, of course, for the secondary as well. I wonder how many times I've said main and secondary projectile slot so far this video. Secondary projectile equipment slot and secondary projectile equipment slot button. All right, cool. Let's save that. Now let's look where we call all these variables. So on awake, we're getting the button by referencing the image. So let's do that for the main and secondary equipment slots for our projectiles. Again, it's going to be in the parent. So we say get component in parent, and we pass true because the game object is disabled and we want it to check disabled game objects. All right, looks good. Now, where else are we referencing these variables to? Let's just find them. So on toggle equipment buttons, we're disabling buttons when we don't want them to be enabled when we're on a second menu. So let's do the same thing by setting the main and secondary projectile equipment slots button status to the is enabled status we pass when we toggle this. And that should be good. Secondary. All right, where else are we using? Let's just see if anywhere else at all. Let's save that. Over here now, I'm going to scroll up to the function name. We have select last selected equipment slot. So this is the last button you've selected when you got to the menu. So now let's make a case for the main projectile slot and the secondary projectile slot. And then we can say that the last button selected is the main projectile equipment slot button or the secondary projectile equipment slot button. So if you don't know how to do this, by the way, you can right click on something and click find all references, and you can kind of go down through and see each place that function or variable is called or declared. So we can save that, and now we can go back to the project. Let's look for the player UI. Let's jump over here. Let's go back into the equipment manager once again, and let's actually drag in our variables. So we have main projectile equipment slot, boom, right there. It's the item icon, and then we have the secondary projectile equipment slot, boom, item icon. Let's save that. Now if I go into the game here, put the arrows in my inventory, like so, standard arrow. If I were to open up the equipment window and go over here, you can see that they do get equipped. Cool, looks real good. Working as intended. You can see here too, I can also shoot them from the bow if I wanted to, so I'll just let an arrow go here. But we have no indicator on the HUD that we're actually holding any arrows, and Elden Ring does give you an indicator of your primary and secondary arrow slots. So let's do that next. Go to the player UI manager once again, but this time we're going to go into the HUD manager. Let's open up the quick slots right here. And now, I think Elden Ring puts them below your left hand icon over here, the weapon slot. So duplicate your weapon slots and rename them to projectile slots. And now I'm going to change the spacing quite a bit. It's going to be a very small amount with the size I'm going to make it. For now, let's just put 0 and see what it's going to look like. We're going to shrink this a bit too. So I want to keep the ratios the same. I think it's 66 to 99 ratio. Yeah, 80-120, so 2/3, 3/3. So I'm going to go 40 and 60. And I'm going to put a spacing of, I want to say like, I'm probably only going to need like 1 to be honest with you, because it's going to be so close. Because I want it to line up with the edge of this weapon slot icon and stay basically directly underneath it. So I'm not going to do this all in video. I'll just get the numbers real quick and pause this and jump right back. So that looks good. Okay, yeah, so that's my ratio. It's 40-60 and the spacing is 1. And now I'm going to change this to main projectile quick slot UI and secondary projectile quick slot UI. Obviously, if you do your UI differently, make it your own. It doesn't need to look like this. I'm just copying Elden Rings because this series is called Elden Ring in Unity, of course. So let's add a Text Mesh Pro component to each of these. Now, very important, don't forget to anchor it in the proper place. The first thing I'm going to do is hold Alt and make it the size of this window by stretching it. I'm going to set the font size to something much, much smaller, probably like 12. You can set auto size if you want, so if your UI is scaling, it will change with it, which is very handy for different monitor sizes, of course. And I am going to go to put a 99 here. Now let's make it so we can center this text. Let's also see it in the inspector. So you can see the square here. I'm going to make this square just the size of the bottom corner of this, just like so. And then I'm going to change this from stretch to anchor by clicking the bottom right. Now we'll always anchor to the bottom right of the square. I'm going to copy and paste that as a child in here, like so. So now that's under the secondary projectile. All right, that looks good. Now we can go over to our Player UI HUD Manager again. Where we have quick slots, let's go ahead and make a new image quick slot for the main projectile and the secondary projectile. So these are the quick slot icons. So the idea here is to have these arrow icons pop up here, only when you're holding a ranged weapon though. So we're going to disable these icons if you're not using a ranged weapon. So we have main projectile quick slot icon, secondary projectile quick slot icon. Very cool. All right, let's copy one of these functions here that we use to set our quick slot icons. So I'm just going to copy set quick slot icon because that was the last one we made. That name is a mouthful, huh? Set quick slot item quick slot icon. So this becomes set main projectile quick slot icon. The quick slot item variable becomes a ranged projectile item variable. And I'm actually just going to pass the ranged projectile item just because this is only going to be called on the owner, so we can get it directly from their inventory. You could pass the amount to, or you could just use the projectile item, or you could pass the amount and you could pass the item ID. You can fetch it from the list like we did before, but yeah, all are valid approaches. I'm just going to do it this way. I'll show you. So rename this variable to projectile item, so we don't have to change as much. And next we're just going to say if the projectile item is equal to null, then we want to disable our projectile item quick slot icon. So we want to make sure it's not there anymore. So main projectile quick slot icon, enabled is equal to false, and if the sprite is equal to null. And then down here, do the same thing. If the item icon is null, we want to set it to false, and then also set the sprite to null. So if it passes the check, we're going to set the main projectile quickslot icon to the projectile item icon, and then we're going to enable it. Cool. Now let's go back up here, and we need to add a text mesh pro object here, so there's not popping up. I'm going to say using TM pro up here in our collections thing. And then we can use the library for text mesh pro. We can get the variable here, and then we can just call this main projectile count. And then we can make one for the secondary projectile count as well. So we're going to update this count in real time, use fire arrows and such. All right, cool. So then we're going to come down here and say main projectile count dot text is equal to, and you could say the amount, or you could say your projectile item dot current amount dot toString. Both are valid. It does not matter. So I'm going to save that. Now I can copy this entire thing here. Now we can do the same thing for our set secondary projectile. So again, you could also just say amount toString, just like that. And then you could pass the amount from whatever way you want. You could get it from the projectile item or some other means. Now let's paste that for the secondary. Set secondary projectile quickslot icon. And then you guessed it, replace the main keyword here now with secondary. And then you're pretty much on your way. So we have to update this in two places. When we're changing our projectile, which is easy because we already have a network function for that when the projectile ID changes. And then we have to do it also when we're firing and we have basically loss in ammunition count. And that's pretty easy to do as well. So let's save that and let's go up to the top here now. And I'm also going to make a game object here because, like I said, we want to disable this when I'm using a bow. Serializable field game object, and we can call this ammo quick slots. Actually, I'm going to call it projectile to keep the naming conventions. I'm going to call it projectile quick slots game object. So it's just very, very clear in the name. It's clear already, but I like being super clear. Now let's go over and drag in projectile slots into our projectile quick slots game object, and let's disable this by default. And drag in our item icon here too, and of course our projectile count for the main and the secondary projectile items. All right, that looks good. Now I am going to disable projectile slots like so. Back over here now to the HUD manager. I'm going to scroll down and let's go look where we set right weapon quick slot. And you can see here it's on current right hand weapon change. This is in the player network manager. Likewise, we have an on main projectile ID changed. So let's go to that function. Let's say if we are the owner, we're going to reference the player UI instance, player UID HUD manager. Then we're going to say set main projectile quick slot icon. Now you could pass your new ID if you were getting it from the world item database, but we're just going to pass the actual range projectile by saying player.playerInventoryManager.main projectile. And then you could pass the item count from the main projectile again, but instead we're just going to go back and erase the item count because again, the way we're doing it, we just don't need it. And we're going to reference the item count directly from the projectile. It's especially not necessary here because the only person ever updating these HUDs is the player who's the owner, and you've already got the item in your inventory, so you can reference it there instead of grabbing it from a database. Of course, both are perfectly acceptable. It just depends on whatever your preference is. Right now, I'm going to go to the path of least resistance, and we're just going to reference it directly from our inventory. Do the same thing for on secondary projectile change. Make sure you set secondary projectile quickslot item icon, not the main. Save that. Now, over on current right-hand weapon ID change, we're going to do a little trick here. We're going to check the item class of this weapon. So under if is owner, because again, this only applies to you, the local player, and your UI. If someone else switches a weapon in your game, it's not going to change your UI. We're going to say if the new weapon class is equal to a bow, and in the future you can say or a crossbow, or a great bow, whatever range weapon you have, then we can toggle and enable our game object for our projectile items. Otherwise, we disable it. So let's make a function for that. Player UI instance.playerUID HUD manager dot. We can call this. Let's go over to the HUD manager and write it out first. We can call it toggle projectile HUD. So right below set quick slot items and right above setting the main projectile and secondary projectile, I am going to call this toggle projectile quick slots visibility. And we can have a status for it being toggled, bool status, And quite simply, all we do is say projectile quick slots game object set active the status of the status. That's it. Come over here now and reference that functionality. And if it is a bow, of course, the status will be true. We want to see it. Otherwise, if it's not a bow, because this is the only range weapon we have right now in our project currently, or range weapon type, sorry, we can say false. Do the same thing for your left hand weapon. So on current left hand weapon ID change, if the new weapon is a bow, toggle visibility true, otherwise false. Cool, awesome. Let's jump back over now to the player combat manager, I believe it's on. Let's see. So over here on release arrow, yeah, here we go. There's a comment I made here somewhere for updating the UI. Let me see if I can find it. And okay, here it is. Right under where we subtract the ammo, we have to determine if we're using the main slot or the secondary slot. And then we call our basically set the main projectile or set secondary projectile, which will update our count. So let's use the switch statement up here and copy and paste it. Switch, if the current projectile slot is main, then we're going to update our main projectile slot by saying player UI instance player UI HUD manager set main projectile quick slot item icon past the newly updated projectile item, which will carry the newly updated ammo count after it's been subtracted from itself. If it's a secondary one, then set the secondary projectile quick slot icon, still using the projectile item here. Okay, save. That looks good. Now, let's jump back over here and let's by default disable these item counts, because if you don't have any, we're going to disable it. So under set main and secondary projectile quick slot icon, we're going to say main projectile count dot enabled is equal to false. And then down here, do the same thing, main projectile count enabled is equal to false. And then do the same thing on the secondary account, but change main to secondary. So if the projectile item is null or the item icon is null, you know you have a problem. Just get rid of the counts and turn them null. I guess you don't have to get rid of the counts if the item icon is null, but I'm going to just in case, because your item icon should never be null. So we're going to say secondary projectile count dot enable is equal to false. Whoops, up here I accidentally put true. This should be false. Now if you pass all these checks, then you set it to true. So right down at the bottom here, after or before you update the count, you want to say main projectile count dot enabled is equal to true. And then down below on the secondary, you're going to say secondary projectile count dot enabled is equal to true. All right, let's save that again. Secondary projectile looks good. Now come over here and let's go to the unequipped selected item. This is on the player UI equipment manager. And we actually don't have an entry for the main or secondary projectile to unequip it. So right now you kind of can't do that. Let's make a case for main projectile, and same thing as before, just change your variable type from whatever you copied to main projectile, and then set it to main projectile instead of the slot that you copied. And then instead of loading whatever equipment, we're going to say load main projectile equipment, and we're going to pass the player.player inventory main projectile. And then of course do the exact same thing here for the secondary projectile. So I'm going to copy all of this, paste. Here we go, secondary projectile. Change main to secondary. Add that into inventory. Cool. Change main to secondary. Load secondary projectile equipment. And then we're going to reference the secondary projectile in the inventory. Excellent. Cool. Now, we did also miss one thing, or I should say I missed one thing. Let's copy the projectile account from the HUD and let's paste it in the equipment manager, because it's always nice to see your ammo count too when you open up your equipment screen, not just on your HUD. So down here we have these main and secondary projectile equipment slots. I'm going to edit the size of these a little bit because it's not going to be exactly the same. I'll probably make it about 40 by 40, and then I'm still going to anchor it to the bottom left, of course. And they're still going to be disabled by default. And I'm going to copy the count here and paste it under the secondary projectile like so. Looks good. Now we need to make two variables for this. They got to be main and secondary projectile count on the player UI equipment manager. So right underneath or above or wherever main projectile equipment slot, make a serializable field for a text mesh pro variable. I am again going to have to call that because we can't use the library now. So let's say using TM Pro, so we can use that library. Cool. Then we're going to say text mesh pro GUI. What a weird name for a variable. And we're going to call that main projectile count. Let's do the same thing for the secondary projectile count. paste that right below there. Secondary projectile account. Okay, so basically now wherever we're updating the icon, we also want to update the amount. And if the icon is not present, we want to just disable the amount. So go to refresh equipment slot icons. And then come down here to where we are checking out and adding the main projectile and secondary projectile item icon. We're going to say main projectile count.enabled is equal to true if it's not null. And we're going to say main projectile count.text is equal to main projectile equipment current item amount toString. Otherwise, and we can do the same thing here now too for the secondary, so I'm just going to paste that and change main and secondary. Otherwise, we're just going to simply disable the main and secondary projectile count text entirely. So much like the icon here, we're just going to disable the text as well. And again, do the same thing for the secondary, and we are pretty much good to go. All right, secondary projectile count, let's save that. Now minimize this, drag in your variables, don't forget to do that. And then I'm going to untoggle my menu here and save this prefab. Cool, looks good. Now let's go. We have a couple bugs, not bugs I should say, things I missed from a Patreon that they told me just a couple days ago. So you can right now use an item and, switch your weapons and jump and use interactables while you're using an item. So I'm going to go ahead and add the checks here. So if we're switching right weapon, I'm going to say if we're performing an action or if we are using an item, I'm going to say simply return. You can also do this on the player equipment manager.switch right weapon function. I'm going to do it through the input manager. It doesn't matter, whatever makes the most sense to you. So now you won't be able to switch a weapon while you use your flask. And now I'm going to do the same thing for jumping. Apparently we can jump too while we're drinking. So I'm just going to make a check here. Yeah, and there is no check for using an item. If the player is using an item, return. That's all. So if you guys just have these places in the game that you find pop up, just go ahead and let me know and also correct them. And I'll correct them on the side of the video here as well. And lastly, your interactables. So you can do this up here under pickup interactable. If we're using an item we don't want to allow our pickup, you can do this with fog wall too if you want. And of course, the site of grace. We don't want to allow interaction if we are using the item. So let's go ahead and put that in there. And then if I go into the game here and drink this and I can't jump, cool. So then I can jump afterwards, working as intended. Now, if I equip the bow, watch, you'll see, boom, the primary and secondary arrow equipment slots pop up under my UI there and under the left-hand weapon. And now if I go to my player inventory manager and I add an item to my inventory for the standard arrow, if I now go and press start, I can equip it by going here. Boom, there it is. If I click it, there it is. I can unequip it. So I can remove it here. If I press the unequip button, there it is. And now it's gone again. Now I can equip it again and check it out. It will be in the UI down there. And of course, when I fire an arrow, check it out, it will update the count. There you go, guys. Working as intended. Now you can go through the menu. So a little challenge for some people there. If you want it to pop up in the inventory slot when you load up the inventory, so basically when I clicked on the main or secondary projectile equipment slot in the equipment screen, you'll notice that an inventory populated and you saw an arrow there. There was no arrow count on that inventory slot. A nice little challenge for you is to make it so that you also see the arrow count on that inventory slot. So definitely go ahead and try that on your own. Now in the next video, we're going to do the same UI work, but for our newly added flasks. So we're going to basically update the flask count. We're going to make it load into the quick slot icon, and we're going to give some quick slots their own little slots in that UI, so you can add the flasks or bombs in the future or throwing knives or whatever you want from those buttons. All right, guys, that will be all from me today. Thank you very much again for joining me on this weekend. I hope you all have a very lovely weekend. And as always, an immense thank you to my patrons. It is genuinely because of each and every one of you this series even exists. So you have my sincerest gratitude. Thank you for the continued support. I will see you guys next week when we continue working on our UI. I hope you all have a lovely weekend.